The city had a way of swallowing people whole. Beneath the soft hum of neon lights and the distant sirens echoing through the narrow streets, life moved in hurried steps, each person lost in their own world, too busy to notice the invisible ones who lived between the cracks. Among those forgotten souls was a man named David. His beard was unkempt, his coat torn at the sleeves, and his eyes, though weary, still carried the sharp glint of awareness. He sat on the cold pavement beside an old brick wall, a battered cup by his side and his loyal dog Max, pressed close against his legs for warmth. The night was wet, rain falling in soft rhythmic drizzles that turned the alleys slick and reflective. Steam rose from the gutters, curling like ghostly whispers in the dim light. The scent of damp concrete mixed with the faint aroma of distant street food, smells of a life David no longer belonged to. He watched people rush past, their umbrellas bobbing, their conversations meaningless to him. No one met his eyes. No one ever did. To the city he was a shadow, someone to avoid, to step around, to pretend not to see. But not tonight. Tonight, something in the air felt different. Max's ears perked up first. The dog's body stiffened, his low growl vibrating through the silence. David straightened, alert. Years of living on the streets had honed his instincts. Danger had a scent, sharp, electric, undeniable, and he could feel it now. Across the street, a police cruiser pulled over beside a flickering lamppost. The engine cut off and a woman stepped out. She was in uniform, neat, confident, her posture that of someone who'd seen trouble before but refused to be intimidated by it. Officer Rachel Taus, David, had seen her before patrolling this sector. Unlike the others, she didn't look through people. She looked at them. Sometimes she'd leave a small brown bag on the corner near his spot. A sandwich, maybe a bottle of water. She never said much, and neither did he. But in the silence between them, there was something unspoken. Respect, perhaps, or quiet understanding. Tonight, Rachel was checking an alley across from him. She moved cautiously, flashlight cutting through the drizzle, illuminating piles of trash and the gleam of wet metal. David's eyes darted toward the darker end of the alley. Something moved there, a shape, quick and deliberate. Then another. Two figures, his pulse quickened. Max gave a low growl. David whispered hoarsely, "Don't talk." "Just listen." Rachel froze. The man she had thought was another quiet bystander was suddenly standing, voice firm despite the rasp. His eyes weren't wild or pleading this time. They were urgent, locked on something behind her. Max began to bark. Short, sharp bursts. Rachel's hand went to her holster. "Step back," she warned, but David's voice cut through the rain. "Behind you." The words came out like a growl. She turned, too late. A shadow lunged from the alley, a glint of metal slicing through the dim light. Rachel ducked, the knife grazing her sleeve. In a heartbeat, David was moving, faster than anyone would have expected from a man who looked half broken. He grabbed the attacker's arm, twisting hard. The man screamed, the knife clattering to the ground. Rachel drew her gun but held her fire. The struggle was quick, brutal. David's movements were desperate but precise, not the wild flailing of a vagrant, but the trained reflex of someone who once knew how to fight. The assailant punched him, catching him across the jaw. David staggered but didn't fall. Max lunged, teeth snapping, forcing the attacker back. Rachel seized the moment, landing a clean strike to the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling into a pile of trash bags. The sound of sirens neared. Back up. For a long second, the only sound was David's ragged breathing and the low growl of Max guarding the fallen knife. Rachel looked at him. Really looked. His face was bloodied, his coat torn further, but his eyes still sharp, alive. "You okay?" she asked, voice steady but soft. He nodded slowly. "Could ask you the same." She gave a half smile, wiping rain and sweat from her brow. "You just saved my life," he shrugged, wincing slightly. "Old habits die hard." "What kind of habits?" "Ones that got me here." Before Rachel could respond, the squad car screeched to a stop. Two officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. She raised her hand quickly. "Stand down!" He's with me. David backed away instinctively, lifting his hands. He knew how scenes like this usually went. The uniforms, the suspicion, the judgment. But Rachel's voice was calm, authoritative. "He's the reason I'm still standing," she said firmly. The officers exchanged glances, unsure. One of them muttered something under his breath about street crazies. David heard it, but said nothing. He'd been called worse. Rachel picked up the knife from the puddle, slid it into an evidence bag, then turned back to him. "You should get that cut looked at." He shook his head. "I'll be fine. You're bleeding. I've been worse." Rain trickled down his face, mingling with the thin line of blood at his temple. He crouched beside Max, scratching behind the dog's ear. "Good boy," he whispered. Rachel crouched too, trying to meet his eyes. "You have somewhere to go tonight?" He gave a faint laugh, short and hollow. "You're standing in it." That silence again, the one that said more than words could. Rachel sighed. She pulled off her gloves, reached into her jacket, and took out a folded plastic poncho. "At least take this." He hesitated. Pride, the only thing he had left. But Max nudged his leg, and after a moment David took it. "Thanks," he muttered. She nodded. "I'll be around." When she turned to leave, the rain had begun to fall harder. The red-blue flash of police lights painted the alley walls in rhythmic bursts. Rachel climbed into her cruiser, casting one last glance at the man and his dog, two silhouettes fading back into the night. David watched the taillights disappear. The adrenaline drained, leaving him with only the cold and the ache in his ribs. Max whimpered softly, pressing closer. "It's okay, boy," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We did good." For a brief moment, a smile flickered on his face. Faint, fragile but real. He didn't know it yet. But that single act of courage, one choice to speak when silence would have been safer, was about to change everything. The city would remember his name, and for the first time in years, David wouldn't just survive another night. He'd begin to live again. The morning after the alley incident dawned grey and heavy. The rain had washed the streets clean, but the city still carried its usual restlessness. Honking cars, steaming manholes, and people hurrying past each other without looking up. At the precinct, Officer Rachel Taus couldn't shake the image of the man from the night before. His cracked voice, his steady hands, the way he'd stepped into danger without hesitation. David. That was the name she'd found in the report. No last name, no address, no family listed. The officers who'd arrived later had taken the attacker into custody, but by the time Rachel turned back, the man and his dog had vanished. No statement. No thanks, no trace, just gone. She sat at her desk reviewing the report, but her eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the city was alive again, indifferent to the stories that unfolded in its shadows. Yet something about this one refused to fade. Her partner, Sergeant Cole, leaned on the doorframe, coffee in hand. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Rachel gave a faint smirk. "Maybe I did," he frowned. "You mean that homeless guy?" "He's not just some homeless guy. He saved my life, Cole." Cole shrugged, sipping his coffee. "Then he's 1 in a million. But don't let it mess with your head. You tried to thank him. He's gone. Move on." Rachel nodded, but her gut said otherwise. Later that day, while patrolling her route, Rachel slowed near the same alley. The rain had dried, leaving behind puddles reflecting the pale sky. The spot where David had been sitting was empty, just an old cup lying on its side, and a few paw prints near the wall. She sighed, feeling foolish for expecting to see him again. She'd even brought a brown paper bag, a sandwich, an apple, and a thermos of coffee, tucked neatly under her arm. "Guess I'm eating this myself," she muttered. Then Max barked. The sound was faint, distant, but unmistakable. She turned. Down the block, near the entrance of an old subway tunnel, a small familiar figure moved. The dog. Tail wagging, nose to the ground, Rachel followed slowly. David was there, seated against the wall, mending something, the strap of an old duffel bag, maybe. His coat looked even more worn than before, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he worked, as though even broken things deserved care. When he saw her approach, he tensed. Max stood, tail wagging cautiously. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Rachel said softly. David didn't look up. "Didn't plan on it." She knelt a few feet away, placing the paper bag between them. "You left before the paramedics could patch you up." "I don't do hospitals," he replied simply. "Why not?" He finally met her eyes. "Because hospitals ask questions I can't answer." The honesty in his tone caught her off guard. She nodded slowly, understanding more than she let on. "Then maybe just have some food instead." He glanced at the bag. "You don't have to." "I know," she interrupted gently. "But I want to." After a pause, he reached forward and took it. Max sniffed eagerly, tail thumping against the wall. Rachel smiled. "He's a good dog." "The best," David said, tearing off a small piece of bread and handing it to Max. "Saved me more times than I can count." "Funny," Rachel said. "Sounds like what you did for me." He gave a faint, lopsided grin. "Guess we're even then." For a while they sat in silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just honest. The city hummed around them, but in that small corner time seemed to slow. Rachel studied him carefully. The way he avoided her gaze for too long, how his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee. There was more to this man, more than the rags, more than the dirt under his nails. "David," she said finally, "what were you before this?" He took a slow breath, eyes fixed on the ground. "Before what?" "Before the streets," he hesitated. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "A translator. Worked with the army overseas." Rachel blinked. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Languages mostly. Arabic, Pashto, Dari. Words were my world once. And now?" He gave a hollow laugh. "Now I talk to no one." Something in her chest tightened. There was pain in his tone, yes, but also a quiet pride. The kind that survives even when everything else is gone. She wanted to ask more, but the radio on her shoulder crackled to life. A call from dispatch, urgent. Unit 211, report to 7th and Mercer. "Possible domestic disturbance." Rachel rose, glancing back at him. "Duty calls," David nodded. "That's the thing about duty. It never sleeps." "Will you still be here later?" she asked. "Maybe," he said, though they both knew that maybe meant no promises. She gave Max one last pat and jogged off toward her car. As she drove away, David watched the cruiser fade into the distance. For the first time in years, he felt something shift, not hope exactly, but the faint memory of it. He looked down at Max. "She's different," he murmured. Max barked softly, as if in agreement. That night, as the city lights flickered to life, Rachel found herself replaying their conversation over and over. She didn't know why she cared so much about a stranger. Maybe it was guilt, maybe gratitude. Or maybe it was the way he carried his brokenness, not as a wound, but as proof that he'd survived. The next morning, she returned to the alley again. Then the day after. Each time she left a bag, food, socks, a small blanket. Sometimes he took them, sometimes he didn't, but she kept coming, and slowly something began to change. David started to talk. Not much at first, just small words, pieces of stories. But over the weeks that followed, their exchanges grew longer. He told her about the villages he'd worked in, the families he'd helped translate for, the promises broken when war ended but left no peace behind. He spoke of his wife, gone years ago, not through death but distance. "She couldn't wait forever," he said once, staring into the steam rising from a cup of coffee Rachel had brought him. "Can't blame her." The man who came back wasn't the one who left. Rachel listened, not like a cop, but like a friend. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. And every night when she drove away, David stayed under the bridge, yet something inside him was beginning to thaw. One evening, as Rachel was about to leave, she turned and said, "You ever think about starting over?" He gave her that same faint smile. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You already did," she replied softly. "The night you saved me." Her cruiser pulled away, red taillights fading into the mist. David stood there long after the sound of the engine disappeared, the paper bag still warm in his hands. For the first time in years, he looked up at the city lights, and they didn't seem so far away. Winter came early that year. The wind off the river cut through the city like glass, and even the street lights seemed dimmer, as though the cold had dulled their glow. Beneath the bridge, where concrete met shadow, David and Max huddled together beside a small, dying fire. It had been weeks since he last saw Officer Rachel Taus, though her presence lingered. The folded blanket she'd left him, the sturdy shoes sitting by the wall, and the way Max still perked his ears every time a cruiser passed by. David had begun to talk to himself more these days. Not out of madness, but out of need. Words were company, and words were what he knew best. He'd whisper fragments of old languages into the dark, rolling syllables across his tongue as though tasting something long forgotten. Pashto, Farsi, Urdu, English. The bridge became his classroom. Max, his silent student. Words, he murmured, are the only thing they can't take from you. Boy, Max wagged his tail, his eyes soft with trust. A week later, as snow began to fall in soft, slow flakes, a familiar voice called from the street. David! He turned. Rachel was standing at the edge of the bridge, bundled in a dark coat, a thermos in her hand. She smiled, tired but genuine. Coffee? She offered. He stood, brushing off his coat. You came back. I told you I would. He hesitated, then allowed a rare smile. I wasn't sure if cops keep promises to ghosts, she laughed quietly. Guess I'm the exception. They sat together on the curb, sipping hot coffee as the city hummed around them. Cars passed, people hurried by, but for a few minutes it was just them and the snow. Rachel studied him. He looked older than before. Thinner, yes, but there was something else in his face now. Awareness. The kind that comes from remembering who you used to be. David, she said, have you ever thought about working again? He chuckled dryly. Who'd hire a man with no address, no ID, and a resume written on cardboard? You'd be surprised, she replied. There's a community center downtown, language program for refugees. They need translators. I could talk to someone. He stared at her, uncertain. You'd do that for me? You already did something for me, she said softly. For a long time, he said nothing. Then finally, I'll think about it. That was enough. The next morning, David stood outside the East Side Community Center, clutching the coffee cup Rachel had given him, as though it were a ticket into another world. Max sat patiently beside him, tail flicking nervously. Through the window, he could see people, men, women, children, their faces a patchwork of languages and stories. Some were smiling, some lost. He recognized that look. He'd worn it himself. A volunteer approached, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes. Can I help you? David hesitated, his voice almost cracking. Rachel said you might need a translator. Her face brightened. You must be David. She told us about you. Please come in. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the hum of voices, Urdu, Arabic, English, and others he couldn't even name. Someone handed him a clipboard. Someone else offered him tea. For the first time in years, people weren't avoiding him. They were welcoming him. That day, David translated for a young Afghan boy who'd lost contact with his mother. His voice was steady, his tone gentle. As the boy spoke, tears welled up, and David's eyes mirrored them. When the session ended, one of the coordinators said quietly, "You have a gift." David looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. "No," he said. "I just remembered who I was." Weeks turned into months. David began volunteering regularly. He cleaned up, shaved, even found an old jacket that fit. Rachel visited often, sometimes dropping off coffee, sometimes just sitting in the back of the class, watching. Each time she saw him standing at the front of the room, speaking, connecting, alive, she felt a swell of pride that surprised her. One afternoon, as she waited for him outside, she saw something she hadn't expected. A group of children running up to him, laughing, tugging at his sleeves. Max barked happily as they played. David laughed too, a full, unguarded laugh that echoed off the brick walls. Rachel couldn't help smiling. When he noticed her, he waved. "Didn't think cops hung around community centers. Guess I'm full of surprises," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment. "You changed my life, Rachel." She shook her head. "You did that yourself," he smiled faintly. "Maybe, but you saw me first." Later that night, she wrote a short note in her report log, not official, just personal. Some people just need to be seen, not fixed, not saved, just seen. She folded it into her jacket pocket and never turned it in. Spring came. The bridge that had once been David's shelter now stood empty. He'd moved into a small room above the community center, nothing fancy but his. The first thing he did was make a bed for Max out of an old blanket and a folded jacket. Each morning he woke before sunrise, took Max for a walk, then opened the center doors. He greeted everyone, in their language, their tone, their rhythm. The man who once hid from the world now translated it. Sometimes he still struggled. The nights were hard, the memories harder. But he wasn't alone anymore. Rachel visited whenever she could. Sometimes they'd share coffee on the steps. Sometimes they just sat in silence, watching people come and go. One evening, she brought him a small gift, a collar tag for Max. It read, "Hero's Companion." David turned it over in his hand, eyes soft. "You didn't have to. I wanted to," she said. "He saved both of us that night," David smiled, fastening it around Max's neck. The dog wagged his tail proudly, the tag glinting in the fading sun. They sat there side by side, the city buzzing quietly around them. Rachel glanced over. "Ever think about what's next?" David looked toward the horizon. "For the first time," he said, "I do." The wind rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint sounds of laughter from inside the center. For years, David had been invisible, a man fading beneath bridges and rain. But now people greeted him by name. Kids ran to him for help. He belonged somewhere again. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was seen. Summer had painted the city in gold. The river that once whispered in the dark now shimmered beneath the sun, alive and restless. The bridge, the same old concrete skeleton that had sheltered David and Max, looked softer now, almost kind. David stood at its edge one morning, the same spot where, months ago, his life had begun to change. Max trotted beside him, tail wagging, his new tag glinting like a badge of honor. He wasn't there to stay this time. He was there to remember. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, the key he'd found months ago, half buried near the riverbank, the one that had seemed meaningless then. It had become a reminder that even lost things have purpose. He turned it over in his palm, tracing the tiny engraving of a pine tree. The metal was worn smooth now, warm from being held too often, too tightly. A voice behind him said softly, "Did you ever figure out what that key opened?" He turned. Rachel stood there, her uniform jacket slung casually over one shoulder, her hair pulled back against the wind. David smiled faintly. "I think it opened something better than a lock." She tilted her head. "Yeah?" "Myself," he said simply. They walked together along the water. Life had moved on. The city never stopped, never waited. But somehow David had caught up to it. The community center was thriving. He'd been hired full-time as a cultural liaison, bridging languages and hearts. Every day he translated stories of loss, of home, of courage, and in doing so rewrote his own. Rachel often stopped by, though she always said it was just to check in. David saw through that, but he never called her out on it. She had her own ghosts to keep company. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Rachel asked, "Do you ever think about where you'd be if we hadn't met?" David smiled, his eyes following the orange trail across the river. "Dead, maybe. Or worse, alive but unseen." Rachel's voice was quiet. "Everyone deserves to be seen," he nodded. "You taught me that." They sat in silence for a moment, the sound of the water filling the space between them. Then Rachel said, "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." He turned to her. "Curious. There's a new outreach program starting next month, a pilot. We're pairing officers with community mentors to help reconnect displaced people with resources. I told them about you. They want you to co-lead it," David blinked. "Me? You," she said, smiling. "Who better to guide others across that bridge than someone who's already crossed it?" For a long time, David said nothing. Then he laughed softly, a sound of disbelief and gratitude mixed together. "I don't even have the right words," he murmured. Rachel grinned. That's ironic coming from a translator. He chuckled, shaking his head. Guess I'll have to find new ones. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his small room, watching the streetlights flicker against the glass. Max lay curled up at his feet, snoring softly. On the table beside him sat the key, its shadow long and thin under the lamplight. He thought about the boy he once was, the man he became, and the stranger he'd turned into when the world stopped seeing him. He thought of all the people who pass by bridges like this one every day, never realizing how many lives flickered beneath them. And he thought of Rachel, of how one act of kindness, one refusal to look away, had set everything in motion. It wasn't charity that saved him. It was recognition. Someone had looked into his eyes and seen a person worth saving. The next morning, David stood once again before his class at the center. The room was alive with chatter, Arabic mixing with Dari, Urdu with Pashto. He raised a hand, and silence fell. Today, he said, we'll talk about bridges. The students looked at him curiously. Not the ones made of stone or steel, he continued, but the ones made of people. Every time we reach across a language, a fear, a memory, we build one. And sometimes, he paused, smiling softly, sometimes we become the bridge. There was a quiet stillness in the room. Then one of the students, a young girl from Aleppo, raised her hand. Do bridges ever break? She asked. David smiled sadly. Only if we stop crossing them. Later that day, as he and Rachel met with city officials to discuss the outreach program, he slipped the old key into her hand. What's this? She asked. A reminder, he said, that everything locked away can be opened. Sometimes all it needs is the right person. Rachel looked down at the key, her eyes glinting. Then I'll keep it safe, he nodded. You already have. Months passed and the program began. Together they walked the streets, not as cop and homeless man, but as partners. They spoke to those living under bridges, in tents, in alleyways. David translated not just their words, but their pain. He'd kneel, meet their eyes, and say, I've been where you are. You're not invisible. Some turned away, some wept, some followed. Each time, Rachel would glance at him. That quiet, knowing look, as if to say, this is why you survived, and maybe it was. One evening, as autumn began to touch the leaves again, David and Rachel returned to the river. The bridge loomed ahead, silent and familiar. Funny, Rachel said. When I first met you here, I thought it was just another call. David smiled. And when you first met me, I thought it was the end. They stood there, watching the water move beneath them, unstoppable, relentless, alive. Rachel asked quietly, So, what happens now? David looked at the horizon, the city glowing in the distance. Now, he said softly, now we keep building bridges. He reached down and placed his hand on Max's head. The dog looked up, loyal and steady as ever. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of rain and the faint hum of life. And as they turned to leave, the first drops began to fall, gentle, cleansing, full of promise. David didn't flinch this time. He lifted his face to the rain, eyes closed, letting it wash over him. Rachel watched him, a quiet smile spreading across her face. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was home.